thank you so much for having us here today. So would you mind introducing yourself for our audience?
Of course, I'm Sally Jastrzebski-Lloyd. I'm the director of Elizabeth Gaskell's house, this beautiful house that you've come to today.
And how did you come to taking the job on at the house?
Right, well, I've been here 7 years, and prior to this I worked for Marketing Lancashire, so I got to promote days out and holidays for people, but I also worked with lots of museums and historic houses, and I really enjoyed that aspect of my job. I loved books, I also liked Elizabeth Gaskell, and the rest is history.
And we hear that you're a keen Pashley cyclist as well, Sally?
I am, yes. I've had my Pashley for 14 years.
Ooh,
so I've got
wow.
a Pashley Princess
Yeah.
in racing green with a basket on the front, and I love her to bits.
Yes.
And I really like the heritage, the history of the Pashley brand. And obviously working at a place like this, I do have an appreciation for history and heritage, and it's a really nice fit.
So can you tell us a bit about Elizabeth and her relationship with Manchester?
Right, so Elizabeth married William in 1832 and they moved to Manchester. They had 3 homes here, and this house was their final home. They moved in 1850, and then there was members of the Gaskell family lived here until 1913. They were really involved with the working people of Manchester, because William was a minister of Cross Street Chapel, which is a Unitarian church in the centre of Manchester.
He was also the chair of the Portico Library, which is also in town and it's still there. You can go and visit it. And he was generally extremely supportive of her writing, her career as a writer. He wasn't like, what you might think of as a stereotypical Victorian father who ruled the roost with a rod of iron. He was a very gentle, loving, supportive man. And he was loved by his congregation and the people who he came across in the Portico Library.
They were both particularly concerned with advocating for the rights of the working people and the poor, so in terms of access to education, improved living conditions, better working conditions. They were both involved with that and quite passionate about it, and actually both of them also taught Sunday school, which for some children would have been their only form of education. So yeah, she lived here all her life, but we do know that she wasn't a huge fan of Manchester, and it was the pollution, interestingly, that she'd often comment upon. But she did use Manchester as either a location in her novels and her short stories, or as an inspiration for a location.
So this room has temporary exhibitions concentrating on Mary Barton and how the Manchester of Mary Barton, bits of it still exist, or where can you find the locations that Elizabeth refers to in Mary Barton, because it's so detailed a description of Manchester in 1848 when she wrote it, that although it was published under a pseudonym, Cotton Mather Mills, some of her friends in the opening pages where she describes the families going for a bank holiday walk in green haze fields. Some of her friends who read those first pages, they thought, oh, this must be written by Elizabeth Gaskell. She was only talking about it the other day. So it's so vivid a description of what it was like. The books aren't original to what he would have had, but they give you a fair representation of what we think might have been here. And they represent all the major authors that the Gaskells knew as either personal friends or acquaintances. There's not very many original things in the house, but anything under Perspex is original, and it's been lent by the family who are descendants of Elizabeth. And then, rather interesting little thing, there's a picture here of an elderly Mr. Gaskell with a young child who is Beatrix Potter, the author of Peter Rabbit, yeah. Because his best friend at university and all throughout his life was Edmund Potter, who was Beatrix's grandfather. Oh, wow. So there's little connections go through the whole Gaskell story.
So what makes Elizabeth a notable author, and especially amongst female writers?
Well, Elizabeth Gaskell, firstly, she was a working mother. She had 4 children, which actually makes her quite unique, and also married as well, and she was supported by her husband to write.
This table, obviously not the same table, but this is where Mrs. Gaskell did most of her writing. So she doesn't get a room of her own. She has to sit in the end of the dining room, but she benefits from the light from the 3 windows. Yeah, you can imagine her sitting, scribbling away, and then servants would be coming up from downstairs from the servants' quarters to ask her about meal planning, and the daughters would be pestering her for a new ribbon for their bonnet, and she was clearly very good at multitasking.
But aside from that, the themes in her novels continue to be universal and accessible to modern audiences. So she talks a lot about inequality, and that could be inequality of wealth between rich and poor, inequality between the sexes. She talks about the treatment of women by men, all things that we're still talking about today, basically.
Yeah.
But interestingly, for the time, she was also very radical in the things that she wrote about. So she wrote about older, unmarried women who were living happy, fulfilled lives, which at the time was quite unusual. It was all about a happy ending, a wedding happy ending, basically.
Elizabeth wrote about the kind of things that middle-class people could have quite cheerfully ignored, which, like the state of working-class housing and the working conditions in the mills. So her first book, Mary Barton, certainly highlights that. She goes on to write about other quite difficult subjects, like her novel Ruth deals with unmarried women, and uniquely for the time she presents Ruth as a very sympathetic figure, and that she's been raped by the bloke who gets her pregnant, and it's written from the point of view of Ruth. It doesn't blame the woman for seducing the man. So she was quite controversial, and some of her husband's congregation found that quite difficult to cope with. And she used to visit women who were imprisoned for being unmarried mothers. She also ran things like Sunday schools and sewing classes for women who were unemployed during the cotton famine strike during the American Civil War, where the Manchester mills refused to deal with cotton produced by enslaved people. So yeah, she was a very important figure in my mind too, in lots of different aspects of mid-Victorian society and life in general.
So she was actually radical, and there's a lot a modern reader can find in there that they can still relate to. And aside from that, they're really good stories, and she writes really interesting, real characters. Her characters aren't stereotypes. They have accents, they have a dialect, they're complex, they're real people. So I like her for that, really, for that aspect.
So if this is the most beautiful room in the house, the next room is the most important room. And this is the last page of her last novel that she was writing when she died very suddenly, Wives and Daughters. So she hadn't actually finished the book. And then this is a letter from Charlotte Bronte, and the one over there is from Charles Dickens, because his magazine Household Words serialised her early novels. And the garden in her day extended all the way down, to follow the wall all the way down to the next side road. So all of that would have been lawns and vegetable patches, flower beds, meandering paths. So if Elizabeth wanted a bit of fresh air, she could just go out into the garden from here.
Do any of the flowers hold any particular relevance?
They do.
Okay.
The garden was immensely important to Elizabeth and her family, for both flowers and also for vegetables, but also as a place to escape. So it was a place she could be herself without a bonnet. The garden you see today has been created by a team of volunteers, and the plants in there are either heritage varieties that would have been around at the time when Elizabeth lived here, but a lot of them are actually linked to flowers that she mentions in her novels and her letters.
So the thinking behind the restoration of the house before it opened in 2014 is that we've recreated how we think it might have been based on all the evidence from historical sources, from Mrs. Gaskell's letters as well, which are absolutely full of gossipy little bits of information. So she writes to her friend Charles Eliot Norton about the pattern on the chintz that she's just bought. So we know what the chintz looked like, so it's a question of sort of matching it as closely as possible.
So what's the story of the house then, Sally, and what does it take to preserve the legacy?
So we opened to the public in 2014 after many years of fundraising and battling to actually save the building. Thanks to nearly £3 million from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, it looks as it does today. Prior to that, the house, after the Gaskell family sold it in 1913, another family moved in, lived here until the 60s, and then it actually became the International Society for the University of Manchester. So it was student accommodation from the 60s to the 90s,
wow.
with people from all over the world living here, partying here, working here. That's a really interesting aspect of the building's history. Sadly, it did fall into disrepair, but thankfully our charity was able to take over ownership of the building and was able to fundraise to restore it and to open it as you see today. There is a lot of work involved in keeping it open. We are a super small staff team, but we have over 40 hugely enthusiastic and dedicated volunteers who help us across all aspects of the house.
So did Elizabeth cycle and her family?
She didn't, because cycling only really became popular in the 1880s and she's actually died by then. Okay. But I do think that she would have appreciated the benefits of cycling for two reasons. She was a big walker. She would easily walk across Manchester with her husband. So they did appreciate the health benefits being outside. So I think she would have liked that about cycling. The other thing is as well, I think she would have appreciated that it was an accessible form of transport and that workers could have afforded it and would have used it to get to work, but also as a recreation as well. So I think she would have been a big supporter of cycling.
That's good to hear. So can you tell us a bit, Sally, about how the house can be reached by bike?
Yeah, we're really accessible to cyclists. The easiest way is probably to cycle on the designated cycle routes on Oxford Road, and we are a couple of minutes from there. And then we've got a cycle storage area where people can leave their bikes while they look around the house.
Yeah, we saw that at the beginning.
Yeah, excellent.
Good to know. So how can we find out about events at the house?
We do a number of events and also online events for anybody who can't travel here. And if you go to elizabethgaskellhouse.co.uk, you can find out all the details.
Thank you ever so much to Sally, Lizzie, Lucy and the rest of the team for their hospitality and for making this interview possible. And to anybody watching, we definitely recommend cycling down to Elizabeth Gaskell's house the next time you are in Manchester, so you can experience for yourself the wealth of knowledge and the warmth this incredible place holds.